Welcome to Midlife Customs at Craig's Garage. On the last video, I narrowed my first 9-inch housing, and on this video, I finally get back to assembling the third member. If you like working on cars and watching DIY videos, then you should hit the subscribe button because that is what I post on this channel. Please take a quick minute to read this disclaimer. I am not a professional, nor do I claim to be. The first thing I'm going to do is install the pinion pilot bearing, which will be installed in this area, followed by the retaining clip. Now that I have it all welded up, I can remove the bearing retainers and the bushings from the narrowing kit. After that, I flipped it over to remove all my painter's tape from when I painted the middle section. Then I just took a moment and a piece of Scotch-Brite to sand off any of the overspray. Here you can see the location where the pilot bearing will actually be installed. Using one of the pieces from the bearing press kit, I sized it up to the bearing to get it ready to install in the center section. After choosing the piece that I thought was the right size, I connected it to the driver part. That is done just by inserting the bolt through the middle and tightening it down. Here you can see how nicely it lines up with the pilot bearing. Then I just tighten it down a little bit more to make sure it doesn't spin or come off. I did add a little bit of gear oil to the outer ring of the pilot bearing, and the bearing will be inserted from the top of the third member case, and you can see we'll be putting the tool through on top. The bearing doesn't have a right direction, it can go in either way, and we'll just be tapping it down lightly until it bottoms out. Here you can see that I keep hitting it and then either it slips or I take a moment to check to make sure that I'm only on the bearing and I'm not on the casing. So I just keep hitting it and then checking it, doing that over and over until I feel like it's bottomed out. So once I felt like it had bottomed out and reached a point where it wasn't going to go any further, I flipped it over. And you can see, just like all the other bearing races, it has this ridge that it'll bottom out on. And I just wanted to make sure it sat nice and flush. Then I turned it back over so I can start installation on the retainer clip. And here's a look at the retainer clip. It has all these little pieces that stick up, and it will be installed to where they face away from the bearing, and then it has the flat parts that will actually go into the groove that keep it from sliding out of the case. Once again, I'm just going to size this up with one of the pieces from the kit, the install kit, and that's going to be on the ridge and just on the inside where you can see it, just going to tap it in without hitting anything else but just that ridge. This kit actually turned out to be really handy, and I'll put a link to it in the description under the video. Then I place the retainer clip in place. And then I'm just going to tap it a few times to kind of get it in place, and you can kind of see when it engages. Once I felt like it was kind of bottomed out and holding in place, what I did was take a flathead screwdriver and I was just gonna kind of tap all the flat pieces and go around it, making sure they were all inside the groove and holding it. I wound up just going around it a couple times and making sure that they were once again just all inside the groove and nice and flattened out. And once I was happy with that, I moved on. One of the next things I wanted to do was actually build like a little rack to hold the third member. So what I did was just take a piece of angle iron and I marked it at 9 inches, then 12 inches from that, and then 9 inches past that. Then I just used a speed square to make some 45-degree marks so that I can cut out those pies and bend it up 90 degrees. So here you can see how I just placed it in a vise and I bent it up. Using a square, I just checked to see if it was 90 degrees, and this is what it will look like. Now I will take that and just mark where the holes from the third member would meet the angle iron, and I will take a pen and just drill all these spots out. That way I can put nuts and bolts through it to hold it together. I did have to grind off some of the angle iron so that it goes around where the bearing caps go, shown here. And I will also be welding the corners together. After I was done welding the corners, I just made a few marks to drill some holes to put it on the engine stand. And I just split the difference, so it was 12 inches. So I marked center at 6 and then 3 to each side. And here's a shot of it mounted on the engine stand. One of the next things I did was I wanted to measure what the factory pinion shim was so that I can go off of that when replacing or reusing that, and that was 26 thousandths. And here you can see the kit comes with several different ones, so by stacking them up and measuring them you can get them close to where you want to be. So all the shims are different thicknesses, and after a while you'll just put a couple together and get them as close as you can. And here you can see I was 26.5 thousandths. Now I removed the old pinion O-ring so that I can place it in the third member. The shims have to be lined up in a very specific way because the bolt pattern only allows for the bolts to go in one way. So after figuring out what that was, I just put a piece of tape on each side so that when I drop it in later, I don't have to figure it out. Then I tightened down all the bolts on the pinion, but I didn't torque them down or anything because it will have to be removed and installed with the O-ring after it's all set up. Then I flipped the support over on the engine stand. Then I just took a couple minutes to check my gear ratio, and you do that by counting the teeth on the rings and then counting the teeth on the pinion. Then you take the number of teeth on the ring and divide it by the number of teeth on the pinion, and that will give you your gear ratio. So one of the things I wanted to point out is that in the kit you get 2 different size bolts, and the reason why they're different sizes is because the longer one is for posi units, which have a thicker flange. So it depends on whether you're using a posi unit or not on which bolts you'll go with, and I'll show right here after it's lined up. Because of this thicker flange, you have to go with the longer bolts. So after getting everything lined up, and I was going to start the bolts and pull it in with just the tension of the bolts, and then I had plans to put it on my vise and torque it down, and it was really hard to do, and I just was not happy with it. So I decided to just go ahead and press on the bearings with my bench press, and then I was gonna take it apart and redo it on the bench, and I'll show how I did that here. So just like when I pressed on the bearings for the pinion, it's the same thing. I used the old case from the old bearing because of this little lip here. It would just catch the press, so I used the casing and then I put the little piece from the kit on top of that and just pressed it on. Once that was done, I just flipped it over and did the exact same thing. Once the bearings were pressed on, I removed the ring from the posi unit and I just took several minutes to really clean it off and use a file to file it nice and flat, make sure that anything's not sticking up. And then I also took another moment just to kind of clean the flat surface of the posi unit as well. Once I was happy with how clean it was, I actually looked up some stuff and I ran across a video where a guy uses some 2x4s to hold the teeth because they're soft and you can clamp it down and not really have to worry too much about the teeth getting messed up, which I still think you should be very cautious with, but I thought it was a great idea, so I figured I'd give that a try. So after getting it pretty much lined up, I just kind of ran the bolts in finger tight before I started using the bench. And I did the same thing. I used the outer race of the old bearing and the piece from the kit to push it down. And then when I was using the jack, as soon as I felt like there was pressure on it, I would stop and then just kind of start tightening the bolts down with a cross pattern. And I would just continue to do that over and over. I would press it down, tighten it up, press it down, tighten it up over and over until it leveled out and it was nice and flush to the ring. And here you can see how it's bottomed out. And once I was happy with that, then I began to remove all the bolts. With all the bolts removed, I still left it in the bench press so that it could keep tension on it, and then I added some thread lock to all the bolts so that I can retighten them down by using the cross pattern, and then I was going to torque them down with the torque wrench to its specific setting. And once they were all done and I knew they were torqued down, I just went around in a circular pattern to double check. Then I removed it from the press, and I really like this technique. I think if you're very careful with it and done right, this was really worth it. So whoever figured this out, thanks a lot. I really thought this one worked well. So now that I had the bearings pressed on and the ring pressed in and torqued down, it was time to install it on the third member. Before doing that, I just applied a little bit of the gear oil to the actual casing. Then I slowly lowered it into place, trying to keep the bearing and the races all together as much as I could before I can put on the adjuster nuts. And it is extremely important that when these things are put in, that the threads are spinning freely and nothing's getting bind, because these things cannot be cross-threaded. They're basically what's going to adjust everything on installation. Now, using the marks that I did on this assembly comes into play so that I can put them exactly back where I took them out from. Before putting the caps back on, I also just applied a little bit of gear oil to each one of those as well. And I just continued to check that the adjuster nuts were spinning freely as I was putting the bolts in. On my next video, I complete installation on the third member and get ready for installation of Explorer disc brakes. If you found this video helpful, please hit subscribe and leave a comment. And as always, thanks for watching.